Greetings. I am Ismail Serageldin. I'm very honored to be the co-chair of the Board of Trustees of the Nizami Ganjavi International Center. It is most fitting that we should be celebrating this special year of Nizami on his 880th birthday. Nizami Ganjavi is not only a towering figure of Eastern literature, he truly ranks with the greatest globally. His contributions, especially his Khamsa, his 5 epic masterpieces, have done much to enrich the global heritage of Azerbaijan, the East, and the whole world. However, it is also worthwhile to remember that Nizami was not only a great poet, he was also a great sage, a hakim, who was well versed in many fields and a great teacher. So today, when we meet under the auspices of the Ministry of Education, I will talk of another aspect of his greatness beyond, obviously, his artistic prowess as a poet. I will talk about his ethics. For some, it may seem surprising that I would seek to celebrate the ethical perspective of the 12th century Azerbaijani poet, thinking that surely our world is so vastly different than his that whatever he had to say on these topics would be of little relevance to the vastly different contemporary world we live in. But ethics is an eternal topic. To seek to differentiate right from wrong, to pursue justice and freedom, surely are topics that have concerned all people from the earliest of human societies. So, from antiquity to Nizami, the discussions of these topics cover some of the same terrain that we have to deal with today, albeit recast in the context of our contemporary and incredibly more complex societies. The efforts to systematize the analytical framework within which to address these concerns certainly dates at least from the times of the ancient Greeks. They not only tussled with ethics, sometimes referred to as moral philosophy, but also established it as the branch of philosophy that involves systematizing, defending, and recommending concepts of right and wrong conduct. Ethics, along with aesthetics, which is concerned with such value-laden aspects as beauty and social concerns with concepts of truth and goodness, constitute a domain of philosophy that we sometimes refer to as axiology. Such issues have been at the core of the concerns of philosophers and thinkers, political leaders and writers from ancient times to the present, no less so in the East than in the West. And many eminent persons have made contributions to discussions of these topics. And in that group of notable global historical figures, Nizami Ganjavi deserves to be recognized and listened to. So allow me to address 2 main themes in this brief intervention. First, some of the fundamental ethical questions that concern us today, and second, what can we glean from Nizami's legacy that can give us an insight as to the thinking of the sage of Ganja on these contemporary concerns. Although he lived over 800 years ago, I do believe that much of what he said is still relevant to our global and societal ethical concerns today, and that his wisdom deserves our attention and respect. Indeed, almost a century ago, the world was being transformed through the crucible of war, the Great Depression, the pandemic of 1918, and then the paroxysm of the devastation of the Second World War, with its more than 70 million victims, the majority of whom were civilians, who suffered mass bombings, deliberate genocide, massacres, disease, and starvation. And coming out of that disastrous half-century, the leading powers of the world created the United Nations and the system of international law and organized transactions, and laid the foundations for multilateral cooperation on common goals, which included, above all, peace between nations. But almost immediately, in 1948, the world leaders adopted a fundamentally new concept, human rights. They unanimously adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and a number of treaties would then add legal strength to the declaration, including and up to a convention for the rights of the child. The second half of the 20th century saw the end of colonialism and of the Cold War, and we also learned to care for the environment. By the start of the new century, the world had developed a largely consensual view. We adopted the Millennium Development Goals covering the period 2000 to 2015, and subsequently the Sustainable Development Goals for the period 2015 to 2030. These current goals recognize the need for humans to live in harmony with nature. But most of the goals are focused on the organization of our societies, with targets like the reduction of inequality, the abolition of hunger, and the halving of poverty. And it is important to note that the global consensus evolved from the MDGs to the SDGs, which have a much broader scope and include concerns for future generations as much as ourselves. It also involves concerns with inequality, with poverty and hunger, and humans' interactions with nature. Indeed, sustainability is to leave future generations as many, if not more, opportunities than we have had ourselves. It requires that our actions today prove sustainable in economic, ecological, and social terms. And this vision of sustainable development is one that is people-centered and gender-conscious, that seeks equity for all and recognizes the interdependence of all living things. An ethical vision that will lead us to act fairly to each other, to nature, and to future generations. Now, all of this was driven partly by recognized self-interest in the long term, but most of it was driven by an emerging set of globally recognized common ethical concerns. Indeed, we have by now all acquired an innate belief that issues of human morality, such as good and evil, right and wrong, justice and crime, have a common core that transcends political boundaries. That core is, we now believe, firmly established on the bedrock of human rights. We recognize human rights as the fundamental benchmark against which every social organization, every law, every transaction can and should be measured, even if certain minor variations or rifts are allowed on some of these concepts, such as the socio-cultural definitions of what constitutes virtue and vice in societies over time. There should be no excuse for transgressing the basic human rights of individuals, no matter what the circumstances. But human rights are individual. They need to be interpreted within a societal context. For everything from freedom of expression to equality before the law has no meaning if a person is removed from society and its governance. So today, globally as much as nationally and locally, we are confronting major issues in every society. And I'm sure that many in the audience will be asking, and what has Nizami got to say about all these concerns? Well, Nizami has much to say. And if we start with the notion of values and social norms, that's what makes a society function. They provide the trust, the glue that holds a society together and makes transactions possible. Our belief in justice, equality, and fairness, and having institutions that ensure as much of that as possible are part of the framework that holds us as a society together. So values we live by and values we judge with also give meaning to such abstract concepts as truth, goodness, and beauty. And Nizami addressed many of these issues, and his words have import, even today. And if we look at governance and think of it in terms of pluralism, the rule of law, transparency, accountability, free expression, and free flow of information are as necessary to good governance as the participation of the citizens. We have come to see these as synonymous with democracy, which adds the element of the legitimacy of the ruling government based on the consent of the governed, usually expressed by periodic elections. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, as was so presciently said by the great Abraham Lincoln. But while we may argue about the details of how that is best achieved, one of the fundamental challenges we face in our world today is how to ensure pluralism and openness to the other. For pluralism and diversity, while they can be enriching, can also be a source of conflict and strife. And we'll come back to this notion of pluralism. But first, Nizami, in looking at how power is wielded in society, was concerned about power and intrigue. He believed that political stability based on justice and equity is essential, and he did support openness with the other and pluralism. He lived by his values and advised his son to avoid proximity of power and the palace intrigues that accompany the lust for power. He said, refrain from seeking the society of kings. It's like exposing dry cotton to the fire's burnings. Light from the fire may be pleasant enough, but to be safe, one must stay a distance off. A moth that's allured by the flame of a candle is burnt when a companion at a banquet table. Today, at a time when the practice of politics gives accolades to those who win, frequently without adequate attention to how they got there, it is important to be reminded that already over 800 years ago, Nizami warned not just of the corrupting influence of the practice of power, but also of the corruption that comes to many in the pursuit of power. And Nizami spoke of justice. And if modern states are based on a social construct that unites the human family within its borders in a framework of citizenship, then the felt presence of a modicum of social justice is the necessary glue that will hold that society together. And so, if social justice has many dimensions, how do we get there? Well, to my mind, the two pillars of achieving social justice are freedom and equality. Freedom entails the exercise of rights, and that requires that we have the capabilities to exercise these rights. That is, we may need to take into account the innate inequalities between individual people. But while the principles of justice can be argued at great length, there is a general perception that we can recognize when actions or outcomes are fair or unfair. We do recognize that something may be perfectly legal, but it's still unfair and therefore unjust. Hence the notion that justice must be tempered with mercy. But there is an ironclad rule that is now as widely accepted as the concept of human rights, and that is equality of all citizens before the law. Equality. To measure equality before the law is but a start. Some people would see fairness as the provision of equal opportunities only. If the result is to have some who are extremely rich and some who are extremely poor, so be it. Others, most of us, in fact, would see that a society where wealth is concentrated in the hands of very few people, while the vast majority suffer in poverty and destitution, is inherently unfair. And so, wealth, enormous wealth, really makes a mockery of measures of inequality, for it is based on greed. No amount of wealth is considered enough. Extreme inequality is corrosive. It hardens the attitudes of the rich and powerful towards the poor and lowly. It builds acceptance of the incongruity of wealth amidst misery and exclusion, undermines the very notions of social justice and social cohesion, makes a mockery of fairness, and leads to the slippery path of class warfare as the only means of redress. Indeed, Oliver Goldsmith in Deserted Village in the 18th century wrote, "Ill fares the land, hastening ill's a prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay." And indeed, recent studies have confirmed our suspicions that far from being a necessary corollary to compensate the talented and inventive, those forces in society that propel society forward, excessive inequality, was inefficient and was associated with a variety of social ills. And what does Nizami have to say about this? He strikes at the root of the problem by talking of greed, and he advocates leading a virtuous life without greed. He says, in your village, upon your own private estate, don't think of eating from another's plate. Fortune will turn upon the unthinking fellow whose foot beyond his garment will allow. Competition is, of course, in every society, but Nizami warned against violence. He believed in peace and non-violence. And in looking back at his own life, he could observe, for as long as I have lived, never in violent way has the wing of a fly been met. Never have I mixed dregs in another's fresh water or sought to disturb another's condition. Never. But he went further. Nizami not only advocates not doing harm to one enemy, but also the best way to use one's short time here on earth was to be good to one's neighbors and friends. And from dusk to dawn, for life to stay is hopeless, the only seed worth growing is the seed of goodness. And because the world will not stay for anyone, being kind to one's friends is best. And this I stress. So Nizami could see beyond the immediacy of his own needs to the behavior that was needed to undergird and support society as a whole. And here he spoke pluralism in societies. Nizami was open to all the cultures of his time. He told all to be open to all the cultures of the world and that they would benefit enormously from such openness. He says in the Heradname that he researched in all the tongues and found pearls and gems of wisdom that he collected and polished with his poetry to integrate them into a whole. He says, from every manuscript some worth came to me. I found and embellished it with jewels of poetry. I filled up my store from the more recent history, the Jewish, the Christian, and also the Pahlavi. I took from every grain that which was excellent. And in from each pod the innermost kernel went, and I joined riches of one tongue to those of another, and the mass into complete whole gather. So beyond welcoming pluralism lies the questions of equality. The most critical issue in all societies is still gender equality, and especially in Eastern societies. And here it is important to remind ourselves that Nizami was writing over 800 years ago, and yet he surprises there too. Let us review his depiction of women. Women in Nizami's epic romantic poems are endowed with great beauty, elevated on a pedestal, and are objects of desire that inspire men to great deeds, as when Farhad literally moved mountains to win the love of Shireen. But the greatness of Nizami is that he does not limit himself to this typical idealized view of women, so prevalent in his time, and also to be found in so many of the chivalry tales in East and West, where beautiful and chaste damsels in distress inspire courageous knights to slay the dragon and rescue the damsel. Nizami portrayed women as full-blooded creatures, well-rounded, who evolved over time, and who could be the equal of men in every way, even in the most unusual, such as physical strength. And a striking example of this is how the coquettish fitna in the Hafta Paitar ultimately carries a calf on her shoulders up and down 60 steps, a feat that human could equal in physical strength. Likewise, it is a wise woman, Queen Nushaba of Barda, who teaches an important lesson to Alexander the Great in the Iskandar-name. The queen, who had recognized Alexander, who had come disguised as a messenger, tells him that she knows who he is and offers Alexander jewels and gold to eat, which he refuses, to which she points out that yet men are killed for such treasure, and then offers him bread, which is produced by men killed for the inedible jewels and stones. So in Islam's world, women learn, and his princesses are educated, skillful, and wise, as well as beautiful. In Layla and Majnun, the two adolescents meet in school where they study together until Qais is smitten by Layla's beauty. Thus, Nizami's views of women as complete beings that can match men in intellect, determination, and even physical strength, as well as being beautiful, evanescent creatures that attract and inspire men, is noteworthy, especially for someone writing in the 12th century. It is one more interesting facet of the magnificent Sage of Ganja. Well, what about society as a whole? Well, on personal behavior and reforming society as a whole, Nizami believed that you start with the law. He also advised his son to learn the law, respect the law, and avoid lies and legal trickeries. Above all, he emphasized the importance of speaking the truth. Here from the verses translated by Smith, but let the law instruct you in good service. Let it not teach you how to lie. And this I stress. And 400 years later, in Hamlet, Shakespeare would elegantly rephrase these same thoughts in the lines he gives Polonius. This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man. Nizami was a profound humanist who believed in the innate goodness of people and their perfectibility. And he wrote much about the values that individuals should adopt in their lives. He was deeply concerned with society and the human condition, to the point that MacDonald would write about him, saying that Nizami was a genuine social reformer. But Nizami was a sage, and it is important to think about what he told us in his legacy. He not only wrote many beautiful poems, his Khamsa, his famous 5 epic masterpieces, but additional poems that were collected in his divan. And they were mostly of a religious or admonitory or ethical character, and which contain indications and symbols for the initiated. So the sage was always present in the poet, and the religious mystic was there in the quiet man who lived his simple, virtuous country life, producing his stream of historic masterpieces. His death in 1209 would leave a void in the world of literature, but he bequeathed us all an enormous legacy. And to those who want wisdom, he recommends that they choose the profound and mystical path of spiritual enlightenment through Sufism. But he warned that it requires the crushing of one's ego to seek the higher truth. This is clearly expressed in his divan as given by Smith's rendition. I went to the wine house last night, but away in I couldn't see. I called and called, but no one inside seemed to listen to me. And then the wine seller finally answers him saying, it's not the time when the doors open by one for anyone. Be more thoughtful. It's no mosque where door is always open, where you can come, go, and push to the front deliberately. And he points out, every religious community in the world is here. Muslims, Hindus, Zoroastrians, Christians, Jews, one community. And listen, if you've anything to say, then first you should go and make yourself dust under their feet. It is that easy. Now it's clear that Nizami is not speaking of a literal tavern where wayfarers and locals go to imbibe real wine and get drunk. Rather, Nizami is speaking of the notion of wisdom, which transcends mere religious practice. No mosque or door is always open. To reach that house of wisdom, you must take the mystical path, but that mystical path requires first that you overcome your own ego, your pride, make yourself dust under the feet of all the wise from all the traditions, and then, and only then, will you gain the insights that will allow you to move towards gaining wisdom. So what can we conclude from that? Nizami's work is more than a paramount symbol of great literature. It is indeed part of the global heritage of humanity. It has, like all great legacies, reached universality through deep-rooted traditions interpreted with great art. It combines the storyteller's skill with the lyrical language of the poet, but reflects the knowledge and wisdom of the sage. We all feel that beyond the art and craft of the wordsmith and the storyteller, there is a sincerity of Nizami. You feel that his sense of justice is not feigned. His spirituality reflects genuine piety, not a showy religiosity. His deep concern for the human condition is not just for the characters in his epics, but for all people. And he continues to inspire. And in the 20th century, Abdel Naim Hassanein, Egypt's most eminent specialist of Persian literature, would devote his masterwork in Arabic to Nizami and his times, and he appropriately gave it the title Nizami Ganjavi, the poet of virtue, an appropriate testimonial to the great Azerbaijani and his enduring legacy. Nizami lives, his values still inspire and have stood the test of time. So when we think of global and current ethics, it is also appropriate to reflect on the views of the sage of Ganja, the great Nizami, on his 880th birthday. Thank you.